Hello, my friend. Tonight we dive deep into the daily lives of Victorians, specifically exploring what sex was truly like during this fascinating period. And believe me, it was far stranger than the stiff collars and rigid manners might suggest. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself stepping into a bustling Victorian city, perhaps London, its streets shrouded in a persistent fog, the air thick with the scent of coal smoke and horse-drawn carriages. The gas lamps are just beginning to flicker to life, casting long, dancing shadows on cobblestone lanes. You hear the distant cries of street vendors, the clatter of boots on pavements, and perhaps the faint, hurried whispers of a couple disappearing into a darkened alleyway. You're about to embark on a journey that will strip away some of those romanticized notions about prim and proper Victorians, revealing a surprisingly bizarre and complex reality. You probably won't survive this journey with your innocent notions of Victorian intimacy entirely intact, but frankly, that's where the true adventure begins, isn't it? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's genuinely fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Victorian era, broadly spanning Queen Victoria's reign from 1837 to 1901, is often stereotyped as a time of extreme prudery and moral repression, particularly concerning sex. On the surface, this image holds true. Public discourse was characterized by a strict moral code, an emphasis on domesticity, and a pervasive silence around anything deemed sexually suggestive. One mainstream historical fact is that decorum and strict social etiquette were paramount, creating an outward appearance of extreme modesty and rigid adherence to Christian virtues. You'd find yourself navigating a society where even the legs of a piano were sometimes covered, lest they provoke improper thoughts. It was a time when the very word leg might be substituted with limb in polite conversation, a truly baffling level of linguistic gymnastics. This seemingly impenetrable wall of propriety, however, concealed a vibrant, often contradictory, and undeniably active sexual underworld. Historians still argue whether the extreme public repression of sexuality actually fueled a more fervent private exploration of forbidden desires, or if it simply made those desires harder to acknowledge and discuss openly. As dusk settles over your imagined Victorian city, consider the very atmosphere that permeated daily life, a constant tension between outward respectability and unspoken realities. This tension created a fertile ground for bizarre practices to flourish, precisely because they were hidden from polite society. Your daily interactions would be filled with coded language and subtle cues, hinting at a reality far removed from the idealized domestic scenes painted in magazines. The pervasive silence around sex, rather than extinguishing desire, seemed to push it into stranger, more circuitous routes. From the rigid public facade that masked a hidden world of desire, let's now consider a peculiar manifestation of Victorian prudery, modesty mania, body concealment. You see, the era's obsession with propriety extended to an almost absurd degree, leading to efforts to obscure even inanimate objects, revealing a deep-seated anxiety about anything that might evoke the human form. It is a mainstream historical fact Victorian society developed an almost pathological aversion to visible limbs, applying this modesty not just to people, but even to furniture. Imagine visiting a respectable Victorian home where, in the parlor, you notice that the legs of chairs, tables, and even pianos were sometimes draped with fabric covers, often called trousers or skirts. You wouldn't just be seeing an odd, decorative choice, you'd be witnessing a literal attempt to desexualize inanimate objects, as if the mere suggestion of a leg, even a wooden one, could somehow spark improper thoughts or feelings. It was a level of prudery that seems utterly baffling to us today, a truly bizarre application of moral censorship. One might wonder if they also covered the legs of their pet poodles, just to be safe. This extreme form of modesty stemmed from a pervasive cultural anxiety about sexuality and the human body. The prevailing moral codes, heavily influenced by evangelical Protestantism, viewed the body, particularly the female body, as a potential source of temptation and sin. To expose any part of it, even metaphorically through furniture, was seen as indecent and potentially corrupting. This wasn't just about avoiding nudity. It was about sanitizing the very concept of physical form from the public consciousness. You'd be living in a world where an ankle, if accidentally revealed, could cause a scandal, demonstrating the extraordinary power attributed to even the smallest glimpse of the human shape. The drive for concealment also manifested in clothing, where layers upon layers of fabric were used to obscure the natural lines of the body, particularly for women. High necklines, long sleeves, and voluminous skirts created a silhouette that was anything but revealing. Yet, as we'll explore later, even within these constraints, subtle hints of sensuality could be conveyed. A quirky tidbit from the era is the widespread concern over bloomerism in the mid-19th century, where women who dared to wear trousers, for practical reasons, were met with ridicule and moral outrage, purely because it defied the established norms of female bodily concealment. This backlash against practical attire shows just how deeply ingrained the modesty mania truly was. Scholars today often debate whether this extreme modesty was primarily a top-down imposition by moral authorities, or if it was also embraced by a population genuinely anxious about the perceived moral decline of their society. It is plausible that while the most extreme examples, like covered piano legs, might have been confined to certain zealous households, the general impulse towards bodily concealment was deeply woven into the fabric of everyday Victorian life. For Victorians, their daily interactions were shaped by a pervasive, unspoken rule: the less seen, the less tempted, making the very act of existing in a body a constant negotiation with a society obsessed with what remained hidden. This intense focus on concealment, even of wooden limbs, truly underscores the era's unique and often peculiar relationship with sexuality. Moving beyond the almost comical lengths to which Victorians went to conceal legs, whether human or wooden, let's now delve into a more serious and indeed bizarre aspect of their intimate lives: medicalized sex, doctors' orders. You see, during this era, particularly for women, sexual health and even basic sexual desire were often removed from the private sphere and brought under the direct, and sometimes intrusive, purview of male physicians. It is a mainstream historical fact that Victorian medical discourse often categorized women's natural sexual desires as pathological, or at least highly problematic. Female sexuality, particularly independent desire or pleasure that wasn't strictly for procreation, was frequently viewed with suspicion, often labeled as a symptom of mental or physical illness. Imagine being a woman in the 19th century experiencing a normal sexual urge only for a doctor to diagnose it as a disorder needing treatment. You wouldn't just be dealing with your own feelings. You'd be confronting a medical establishment that was actively trying to suppress or control a fundamental part of your being, often with questionable methods. It was as if your very nature was a disease. This medicalization was partly a result of the prevailing belief that women were inherently delicate, prone to nervous disorders, and ruled by their reproductive organs. Conditions like hysteria became a catch-all diagnosis for a vast array of female complaints, from anxiety and insomnia to irritability and, yes, even sexual desire. Physicians, almost exclusively male, became the gatekeepers of female well-being, including their intimate lives, often to the exclusion of the women's own perspectives or experiences. A quirky tidbit from the period is the proliferation of medical texts offering advice on how to manage a wife's nervous constitution, often implying that a lack of sexual fulfillment or, conversely, an excess of passion could both lead to illness. It was a no-win situation for women, where their bodies were constantly under medical scrutiny and judgment. The consequences of this medical control were far-reaching. Women's bodies became sites for medical intervention, even when no true physical ailment existed. Their private experiences were pathologized, leading to diagnoses and treatments that aimed to bring their sexuality into alignment with patriarchal and societal expectations of female modesty and submission. This medical authority reinforced the idea that women were inherently fragile and needed male guidance even in the most intimate aspects of their existence. You might find yourself subjected to a doctor's examination for symptoms that were, to our modern understanding, perfectly normal expressions of female physiology or emotion, but which were, at the time, seen as requiring medical intervention. Scholarly discussions often ponder whether this medicalization of female sexuality was a conscious effort to control women and reinforce patriarchal power, or if it genuinely stemmed from a limited scientific understanding combined with prevailing cultural anxieties about female desire. It is plausible that it was a complex interplay of both, where medical ignorance converged with societal prejudices to create a system that ultimately disempowered women. For Victorian women, their daily lives were not just influenced by moral strictures, but by the authoritative pronouncements of a male medical establishment that claimed to understand their intimate needs better than they did themselves, making their very bodies subject to the bizarre orders of Victorian medicine. Having seen how male physicians medicalized and often suppressed female desire, let's now examine one of the most bizarre and frankly unsettling treatments for women's supposed ailments: hysterias, cure, pelvic massage. You see, during the Victorian, it a vast array of female complaints, from anxiety to irritability, were lumped under the catch-all diagnosis of hysteria, and its prescribed remedy often involved manual stimulation by a doctor, blurring the lines between medical treatment and something far more intimate. Medical texts and practices of the 19th century frequently cited hysteria as a common, debilitating condition affecting countless women. Its symptoms were incredibly broad: nervousness, insomnia, irritability, faintness, a tendency to weep, or even excessive sexual desire. The prevailing medical theory, rooted in ancient Greek ideas of a wandering womb which we might remember from our Renaissance journey, showing how some bizarre ideas persisted, suggested that hysteria was caused by a buildup of humors or vapors in the female reproductive organs. A widely held belief of the time was that releasing these vapors or achieving a paroxysm, what we would now recognize as an orgasm, was essential for a woman's health. Imagine being a woman in distress, seeking help for genuine symptoms, only to be told your cure lay in a doctor providing manual pelvic massage to achieve a hysterical paroxysm. It certainly put a strange spin on a doctor's visit. turning a medical consultation into something deeply uncomfortable and intrusive. The practice of treating hysteria with manual stimulation by a physician became astonishingly common, particularly in the latter half of the century. Doctors would perform these treatments in their offices, with or without the presence of a chaperone. The process was often lengthy, requiring multiple sessions before a paroxysm could be induced. This led to considerable fatigue for the physicians, prompting the invention of early electromechanical devices, like the vibrator, to mechanize the process. A curious tidbit is that these vibrators were initially marketed as legitimate medical instruments, designed to relieve doctors of the arduous manual labor involved in treating their hysterical female patients. It makes you wonder how long it took before someone, somewhere, realized the broader potential of these medical devices. The implications of this cure were profound and disturbing. It pathologized female sexual pleasure, framing it not as a natural human experience, but as a medical symptom requiring professional intervention. Women were denied agency over their own bodies and desires, with their sexual relief administered by male authority figures. The boundary between medical care and sexual exploitation was incredibly blurry, if it existed at all. The ethical questions surrounding this practice are, to put it mildly, immense. Researchers today actively examine whether this widespread treatment was primarily a reflection of male physicians' control over female bodies and their sexuality, or if it genuinely arose from a sincere, albeit misguided, attempt to alleviate suffering within the confines of limited medical knowledge. It is certainly plausible that both factors played a role, creating a system that was both therapeutically dubious and deeply exploitative. For Victorian women, their intimate lives were not just privately managed but publicly, and strangely, medically intervened upon. The experience of seeking relief for common anxieties could lead to bizarre and unsettling cures, forever linking their psychological well-being to a doctor's hands and a very particular kind of paroxysm. This strange chapter in medical history reveals the bizarre ways in which societal anxieties about female sexuality manifested, transforming a doctor's office into a space of unexpected and often disturbing intimacy. Following the unsettling revelations about the medical cure for hysteria, let's now plunge into another facet of Victorian sexual anxiety: masturbation panic, moral decay. You see, self-pleasure, particularly male masturbation, was viewed with an almost apocalyptic dread, believed to be the root cause of an astonishing array of physical and mental ailments, leading to truly bizarre methods of prevention and cure. During the Victorian era, the act of masturbation, often referred to by euphemisms like self-abuse or the solitary vice, was considered a grave sin and a terrifying threat to health. This wasn't merely a moral judgment, it was a pervasive medical belief. A widely documented historical truth reveals that medical literature of the time linked masturbation to an astounding list of afflictions, including insanity, blindness, epilepsy, consumption, tuberculosis, spinal degeneration, and even premature death. Imagine being a young person, experiencing natural urges, only to be bombarded with terrifying warnings that such an act would literally drive you mad or kill you. You wouldn't just be fighting personal desire, you'd be battling a fear instilled by doctors, parents, and moralists alike. A truly overwhelming psychological burden. This intense fear of masturbation stemmed from a complex mix of religious condemnation, nascent and often misguided medical theories, and societal anxieties about self-control, purity, and the proper channeling of vital energy. It was believed that seed was a precious fluid, and its waste through self-abuse led to a depletion of bodily strength and mental faculties. For women, the concern was often about loss of purity and the onset of hysteria, linking self-pleasure to their already medicalized sexuality. A particularly strange, if somewhat humorous, tidbit involves the invention of anti-masturbation devices. These included spiked rings worn on the penis at night to cause pain upon erection, or elaborate cages and restraints designed to prevent contact. For girls, some doctors recommended clitoridectomies, removal of the clitoris, as a cure for persistent masturbation. It paints a grim, almost dystopian picture of attempts to control intimate behavior. The measures taken to prevent self-abuse were not limited to medical interventions. Parents were advised to closely monitor their children, ensuring they slept on hard beds, had cold baths, and wore special nightwear that prevented contact with their genitals. Strict diets, devoid of stimulating foods, were also recommended. The constant vigilance and the fear instilled created a pervasive atmosphere of anxiety around the body and its natural urges. Picture a child constantly under surveillance. Every movement scrutinized. Their developing sexuality viewed not with understanding, but with suspicion and dread. Modern analyses by historians and medical scholars widely suggest that this masturbation panic was less about genuine medical concern and more about controlling sexuality, particularly male sexuality, within a highly moralistic and patriarchal society. It is certainly plausible that these exaggerated warnings and bizarre cures serve to reinforce societal norms of self-control, discipline, and the channeling of male energy into productive, non-sexual pursuits. For Victorians, their intimate lives were haunted by this pervasive dread, transforming a natural act into a source of profound guilt and terror. The bizarre lengths to which society went to prevent sexual abuse truly highlight the era's deep-seated anxieties about uncontrolled desire and the perceived fragility of both body and mind when confronted with the specter of moral decay. Leaving behind the horrifying cures for masturbation, let's now consider how Victorian societal anxieties about the body and sexuality were paradoxically expressed and concealed through female fashion, sensual constraints. You see, while women's clothing was designed for modesty and restriction, it often subtly hinted at, and even enhanced, an underlying sensuality, creating a fascinating push-and-pull between concealment and allure. Victorian women's fashion is famously characterized by its voluminous skirts, high necklines, and layers upon layers of fabric. At first glance, these garments appeared designed purely for modesty, covering almost every inch of the body. Indeed, a widely accepted historical understanding confirms that the ideal Victorian woman was expected to be a paragon of purity and domesticity, and her clothing reflected this ideal of demureness and virtue. Imagine trying to move freely, let alone engage in any sort of physical activity, while encased in a steel-boned corset, multiple petticoats, and a heavy skirt that swept the floor. You wouldn't just be making a fashion statement. You'd be making a statement about your social status and your adherence to rigid gender roles. Effectively, a walking monument to constraint. Yet, within these very constraints, a subtle and often powerful form of sensuality emerged. The corset, far from simply being a tool of torture, served to create an exaggerated hourglass figure, emphasizing a tiny waist and pushing the bosom upwards. While the décolletage might have been modest by modern standards, the pronounced curve of the bust and hips, achieved through extensive boning and padding, was undeniably alluring, creating a dramatic silhouette that hinted at the figure beneath. A fascinating detail from fashion history reveals that women's dresses often featured elaborate draping and ruching around the bustle area, drawing attention to the posterior in a way that, while not explicit, certainly emphasized curves. It was like wrapping a present in layers of paper, only to tie an enormous, eye-catching bow right where you wanted attention drawn. The rustle of a woman's skirts, the subtle sway of her hips beneath the voluminous fabric, the glimpses of a gloved hand or a tiny, carefully shod foot, these seemingly innocuous elements could all become part of a complex language of subtle allure. The very act of concealing could create fascination, sparking curiosity about what lay beneath the layers. A peculiar tidbit is the popularity of certain fabrics, like silk and velvet, which, despite their weight, could drape and shimmer in ways that emphasized movement and the underlying form, adding to the sensual, albeit hidden, appeal. You might hear the soft swish of a woman's dress as she walked past, a whisper of sound that, combined with a fleeting scent of perfume, could be more evocative than any overt display. Discussions by cultural historians often explore whether these fashion choices were primarily a reflection of patriarchal control over female bodies, or if women themselves found ways to express agency and subtle sensuality within the rigid confines of the era's sartorial norms. It is certainly plausible that while external pressures dictated the overall form, women cleverly manipulated details to achieve both respectability and a degree of allure. For Victorian women, their daily attire was a complex performance, a balancing act between virtue and subtle sensuality, ensuring that even under layers of fabric, the echoes of desire found their way into the visual landscape of the age. Following the intriguing paradox of female fashion, which managed to be both constraining and subtly sensual, let's now turn our attention to the gentleman of the era, male fashion, coded signals. You see, Victorian men's attire, though seemingly drab and uniform, was in fact a complex system of subtle cues, conveying status, respectability, and even hinting at a certain virility, often without an ounce of overt display. A fundamental shift in male fashion during the Victorian era was the move towards a more subdued and conservative aesthetic, famously embodied by the dark, tailored suits and rigid collars. This wasn't merely a stylistic choice. It reflected a societal emphasis on seriousness, business acumen, and moral rectitude. A commonly accepted historical observation highlights that the flamboyant silks and bright colors of earlier centuries gave way to somber wools and precise tailoring, signaling the rise of the industrialist and the professional man. Imagine a sea of gentlemen in black frock coats and top hats moving through the city streets. You wouldn't just be seeing uniformity. You'd be witnessing a visual representation of self-control, discipline, and a subtle yet pervasive power. Yet, within this apparent uniformity, subtle elements of male fashion conveyed status and, by extension, a certain kind of appealing masculinity. The quality of the fabric, the precision of the tailoring, the cut of the coatsole spoke volumes about a man's wealth and position. A well-fitted suit, even in dark wool, emphasized broad shoulders and a narrow waist, hinting at an athletic or powerful physique beneath the fabric. The crispness of a white shirt, the knot of a perfectly tied cravat, or the shine of polished boots all contributed to an image of meticulous self-control and success. A fascinating detail from the sartorial history of the period is the increasing importance of the waistcoat vest, which, though partially concealed by the coat, offered opportunities for subtle patterns, colors, or watch chains, serving as a quiet point of individual expression within the otherwise rigid ensemble. It was like a secret handshake among gentlemen, signaling taste and status without a word. The subtle allure of male fashion also extended to accessories. A wet beard or mustache, a signet ring, or a perfectly chosen walking stick could all add to a man's perceived gravitas and attractiveness. These weren't overt displays of sensuality, but rather coded signals of maturity, reliability, and success, qualities that were highly desirable in a marriage partner. A quirky tidbit is the intense public debate over the hirsute problem. In the mid-19th century, with articles discussing the proper length and style of beards, and some advocating for shaving for reasons of hygiene or professionalism. This seemingly trivial debate underscores how even minor aspects of male appearance were imbued with significant social and even moral meaning, subtly contributing to perceptions of virility and character. Cultural analysts often explore whether the move towards more sober male attire was a conscious effort to differentiate serious male roles from the more decorative female roles, or if it reflected a broader societal shift towards industrialization and a less ostentatious display of wealth. It is certainly plausible that while the primary aim was to convey respectability and professionalism, the underlying physique and the subtle details of a well-dressed man still conveyed an undeniable, albeit constrained, masculine appeal. For Victorian men, their daily clothing was a carefully constructed performance, a silent language spoken through fabric and cut, allowing them to project an image of power, control, and a subdued yet distinct form of masculine allure. From the subtle, sartorial signals of Victorian men, let's now transition to a far less subtle and strictly forbidden visual medium that thrived underground: pornography, illicit delights. You see, despite the pervasive public prudery, a robust and clandestine market for explicit materials existed, providing a stark counterpoint to the era's outwardly rigid morality. The existence of Victorian pornography is a well-established historical reality, challenging the popular notion that the era was entirely devoid of explicit content. While publicly condemned and legally suppressed, print shops and underground networks produced a steady stream of erotic images, stories, and even peep show devices. Imagine a respectable gentleman, after a day of business, secretly slipping into a hidden room to peruse illicit etchings or a scandalous novella. You wouldn't just be witnessing a private act. You'd be seeing a direct rebellion against the pervasive moral code, a secret world where forbidden desires found visual expression. It was like a hidden current, flowing beneath the perfectly manicured lawns of Victorian society. Victorian pornography took many forms. Engravings, lithographs, and early photographs depicted nude figures, explicit sexual acts, and often scenarios involving cross-dressing, prostitution, or sadomasochism. These images were often crude by modern standards, but undeniably explicit for their time. Literary pornography, ranging from short stories to full-length novels, circulated in manuscript form or through clandestine printing presses. A fascinating detail from the era is the sheer volume of French postcards that were smuggled into Britain from continental Europe, often depicting women in suggestive poses or in various states of undress. These were eagerly sought after by collectors and played a significant role in the underground trade. It's almost as if the more society tried to suppress sexual imagery, the more inventive and widespread its illicit production became. The production and distribution of pornography were, of course, illegal and carried significant risks, including fines, imprisonment, and social ruin if discovered. This illegality often made the material even more alluring to those seeking forbidden thrills. Publishers and distributors operated in secrecy, using coded language and hidden networks to conduct their business, catering to a clientele that spanned all social classes, from the working man to the aristocracy. You might be a bookseller by day, discreetly slipping scandalous prints to a trusted client from under the counter. The thrill of the forbidden adding an extra layer of danger to your commercial transactions. Modern historians often analyze the content of Victorian pornography to understand the era's sexual anxieties, power dynamics, and societal desires that were suppressed in mainstream culture. Was it merely a reflection of male sexual fantasies, or did it also offer a hidden space for exploring taboo subjects and challenging prevailing norms, even if inadvertently? It is certainly plausible that while condemned, its very existence provided a crucial, albeit illicit, outlet for the sexual urges and curiosities that the moralistic society attempted to deny. For Victorians, their private lives, for some, included these forbidden delights, a testament to the enduring human drive to seek out and explore the depths of desire, even when doing so meant stepping far beyond the boundaries of respectable society. This pervasive, hidden market truly underscores the hypocrisy and complexity of Victorian sexual morality. From the hidden world of illicit pornography, let's now emerge into a far more visible, yet equally condemned, aspect of Victorian urban life: prostitution's rise. Urban necessity. You see, despite the era's fervent moralizing, commercial sex was an undeniable and pervasive reality in every Victorian city, driven by complex social and economic forces that made it an unavoidable presence. The widespread existence of prostitution in Victorian cities, from the teeming slums of London to the docks of Liverpool, is a well-established historical fact. It was an omnipresent feature of urban landscapes, often operating openly in certain districts, despite constant attempts by authorities and moral reformers to suppress it. Imagine walking through a bustling street at night and encountering women, openly soliciting passers-by, their attire and demeanor marking them as part of the unfortunate class. You wouldn't just be observing a social ill. You'd be witnessing a stark reflection of economic desperation and the unmet sexual demands of a society with rigid social norms. It was a visible wound on the face of Victorian respectability, a constant, uncomfortable reminder of unaddressed societal issues. The sheer scale of prostitution was staggering. Estimates for London alone ranged from tens of thousands to as many as 80,000 prostitutes at various points in the century. Although precise figures are difficult to ascertain due to the clandestine nature of the trade, the motivations for women entering prostitution were overwhelmingly economic. For many, particularly young women from impoverished backgrounds, it was a desperate means of survival, offering a way to earn money in a society with limited opportunities and abysmal wages for working-class women. A poignant detail from historical accounts shows that factory girls or domestic servants, earning barely enough to survive, might turn to prostitution intermittently just to buy food or avoid the workhouse. It was a bleak choice between two harsh realities. The demand for prostitution was equally robust. Victorian society imposed strict sexual mores, particularly on unmarried men, who were expected to remain chaste until marriage, which often came later in life due to economic constraints. This created a large pool of men with unmet sexual needs, the existence of a vast servant class, and a transient population of sailors, soldiers, and migrant workers further fueled this demand. A quirky tidbit from the era is the prevalence of flash houses or dens of iniquity, which were often disguised seemingly respectable pubs or coffee houses, but secretly served as places for prostitutes to meet clients. It was like a game of moral hide-and-seek, where illicit activities thrived, just beneath the surface of everyday life. Historians widely discuss whether the widespread presence of prostitution during the Victorian era served as a safety valve for male sexual urges, thereby supposedly protecting respectable women from assault, or if it simply exacerbated the exploitation of vulnerable women. It is plausible that while moralists condemned it, pragmatic officials often tolerated its existence, recognizing it as an inevitable, if unpleasant, consequence of urban life and societal pressures. For Victorians, their daily lives, whether they admitted it or not, were lived in a society where commercial sex was a pervasive, undeniable, and often tragic reality, a stark symbol of the deep contradictions that lay beneath the era's polished exterior. From the widespread and often desperate reality of prostitution, let's now turn to a particularly chilling example of the Victorian state's response: contagious diseases, acts, targeted women. You see, these parliamentary acts, ostensibly aimed at controlling venereal disease, created a system that brutally policed and dehumanized women suspected of being prostitutes, stripping them of their basic rights. The Contagious Diseases Acts, passed in Britain between 1864 and 1869, were a series of laws that allowed police in garrison towns and port cities to arrest women suspected of being common prostitutes and subject them to compulsory internal medical examinations for venereal diseases. A fundamental historical truth is that these women, if found to be infected, could be detained in lock hospitals for months, against their will, until they were cured, even if the symptoms simply subsided. Imagine being a woman in a public place, merely walking alone, and being accosted by a policeman, dragged to a clinic, and forced into an invasive examination, simply because he suspected you of being a prostitute. You wouldn't just be losing your dignity, you'd be losing your freedom, your bodily autonomy, and any semblance of legal protection. It was a terrifying reality, a state-sanctioned assault on vulnerable women. These acts were a response to concerns about venereal disease, primarily syphilis and gonorrhea, spreading among soldiers and sailors, which was seen as weakening the military and naval forces. The underlying assumption was that women, specifically prostitutes, were the sole source of the infection, and therefore, their bodies needed to be controlled and cleaned for the sake of male health and national defense. Men, even if they frequented prostitutes, were almost never subjected to similar examinations or detention. A particularly perverse detail from the implementation of these acts is the arbitrary nature of suspicion, where any woman deemed to be walking too slowly, dressing too poorly, or simply unaccompanied could be targeted, effectively criminalizing poverty and independent female movement. It was a legal framework that seemed designed to punish women for existing in public. The impact on the lives of the targeted women was devastating. They faced immense humiliation, social ostracism, and psychological trauma from the forced examinations and detentions. Many committed suicide rather than endure the indignity. The act sparked a powerful feminist backlash, led by figures like Josephine Butler, who argued vehemently against the double standard and the violation of women's civil liberties. This reform movement eventually led to the repeal of the Acts. A quirky tidbit from the period's reform efforts is the clever use of public protests and petitions, gathering thousands of signatures, which eventually brought enough political pressure to bear on Parliament. It showed the power of collective action, even in a society that tried to silence certain voices. Historians and social commentators have widely discussed whether the Contagious Diseases Acts represented a pragmatic, albeit harsh, public health measure, or if they were primarily a manifestation of patriarchal power and class control, scapegoating vulnerable women for societal problems. It is certainly plausible that while public health was cited, the underlying motivations were rooted in a desire to control female sexuality and maintain social order. For Victorian women suspected of prostitution, their daily lives were lived under the constant threat of these invasive laws, turning their bodies into battlegrounds for state control and moral purity, making intimacy a dangerous profession with devastating, state-imposed consequences. The legacy of these acts serves as a chilling reminder of how societal anxieties can manifest in the brutal suppression of human rights. From the oppressive reach of the Contagious Diseases Acts, which policed women's bodies at home, let's now look outward to where some Victorians sought sexual freedoms beyond rigid British morality, sex tourism, abroad adventures. You see, for those with the means, continental Europe, particularly cities like Paris and Brussels, offered a stark contrast to Britain's prudery, becoming destinations for illicit pleasures and less constrained expressions of desire. The phenomenon of Victorians traveling abroad specifically for sexual encounters is a well-documented historical truth. While Britain was grappling with its strict moral codes, cities on the continent, especially Paris, cultivated a reputation for being more liberal, sophisticated, and tolerant of various forms of sexual expression. Imagine being a British gentleman, stifled by the pervasive moralism of London, stepping off a train in Paris and entering a world where courtesans were celebrated, cafes buzzed with less inhibited conversations, and artistic nudes were openly displayed in salons. You wouldn't just be on vacation. You'd be entering a zone of moral liberation, where the rules you lived by at home seemed to momentarily dissolve. It was like swapping a stiff suit for a silk dressing gown, much more comfortable, and certainly more revealing. Paris, in particular, was renowned for its diverse offerings, from grand opera houses with private boxes where discreet assignations could be made, to specialized brothels known as maisons de tolerance, or houses of tolerance, that catered to various tastes and budgets. The city provided a spectrum of sexual services. Wealthier clients could even arrange for long-term arrangements with courtesans who offered companionship beyond mere physical intimacy. A fascinating detail from contemporary travelogues and personal letters reveals how British visitors, while publicly maintaining an air of disapproval, privately indulged in these continental liberties, often keeping their adventures a strict secret upon returning home. It was a classic case of what happens in Paris stays in Paris. Long before Las Vegas coined the phrase, the motivation for this sex tourism wasn't solely about physical gratification. It was also about escaping the suffocating hypocrisy and moral judgment prevalent in Britain. For many, it represented a temporary freedom from the rigid class structures and the constant scrutiny of Victorian society. It allowed for experiences that were simply unthinkable in a British context, where even minor transgressions could lead to social ruin. A quirky tidbit is the anecdotal evidence of guidebooks for gentlemen travelers, which, while ostensibly about culture often contained thinly veiled tips on where to find entertainment abroad. This subtle guidance reflects the widespread, if unspoken, demand for such information among British tourists. Historians often interpret this pattern of sex tourism as a clear indicator of the profound contradictions within Victorian morality, suggesting that the strictness at home simply pushed certain behaviors underground or, in this case, overseas. It is certainly plausible that while public morality in Britain demanded chastity and propriety, the economic realities and personal desires of many ensured a steady stream of travellers seeking more liberal sexual environments. For Victorians, their daily lives could swing between extreme repression and daring indulgence, with a journey across the English Channel offering a temporary passport to a world where desires, though still potentially risky, could be explored with a greater sense of anonymity and a fleeting taste of true, albeit illicit, freedom. Having explored the escapades of Victorians seeking sexual freedoms abroad, let's now return to a far more perilous form of hidden desire within Britain itself: homosexuality, hidden lives. You see, in an era that criminalized same-sex relations, those who experienced such desires were forced into a clandestine existence, constantly navigating a treacherous landscape of societal condemnation and severe legal penalties. The Victorian era, despite its outward focus on family and procreation, saw the criminalization of same-sex acts between men, often under broadly interpreted sodomy laws inherited from earlier centuries. A fundamental historical truth is that the Gross Indecency Clause of the 1885 Criminal Law Amendment Act, in particular, made any homosexual act between men, even if consensual and in private, a serious crime punishable by imprisonment, hard labor, or even worse. Imagine living in a society where your deepest affections, your most intimate desires, could lead to public ruin, a lengthy prison sentence, or even societal ostracism by your own family. You wouldn't just be keeping a secret. You'd be living a double life, constantly terrified of exposure, where every unguarded glance or whispered word could lead to catastrophe. It was a terrifying game of hide-and-seek, but with your entire life at stake. This intense legal and social repression forced same-sex desire deeply underground, leading to the formation of secretive networks, coded languages, and hidden meeting places. Men who sought intimate relationships with other men often frequented specific pubs, parks, or even public toilets known as cottages, where they could find discreet encounters. The risk was immense, as police sometimes employed plainclothes officers to entrap and arrest men. A haunting detail from historical records includes the infamous trials of Oscar Wilde, whose public downfall in the late 19th century served as a stark warning to others, illustrating the devastating consequences of exposure. His tragic fate cast a long, chilling shadow over countless hidden lives. For women, while lesbian relationships were generally not criminalized in the same way, they were often rendered invisible or simply dismissed by a patriarchal society that struggled to conceive of female sexuality outside the context of male desire. However, closed female friendships, sometimes referred to as Boston marriages in later periods, could provide emotional and physical intimacy, often existing within a respectable, if sometimes ambiguous, social sphere. A quirky tidbit is the literary subtext in some Victorian novels, where intense female friendships can be read with a queer sensibility, hinting at deeper bonds that went unacknowledged by mainstream society but were perhaps understood by a knowing few. It's like finding secret messages, hidden within plain sight, Historians grapple with the challenge of reconstructing these hidden lives, often relying on fragmented legal documents, private diaries, or coded literary references. The inherent secrecy means much remains unknown. It is certainly a profound point of discussion whether the extreme criminalization of homosexuality in Victorian Britain primarily suppressed same-sex acts, or if it merely drove them underground, fostering subcultures and networks that, despite their dangers, provided vital spaces for expression and connection. For Victorians who felt this forbidden attraction, their daily lives were a constant negotiation between authentic desire and the crushing weight of societal judgment, a testament to the human spirit's resilience in the face of profound adversity. Their stories, though often silenced, offer a poignant glimpse into a world of courage, secrecy, and often heartbreaking loss. Stepping from the perilous world of hidden homosexual lives, let's now consider another form of challenging gender norms that often intersected with clandestine desires: cross-dressing, gender bending. You see, for some Victorians, donning the clothing of the opposite sex was not merely a theatrical performance, but a deeply personal expression, often tied to their sexuality and operating on the fringes of acceptable society. The act of cross-dressing, whether for entertainment or personal expression, existed throughout the Victorian era, defying the rigid gender roles so strongly enforced. This wasn't just about men occasionally dressing as women for comedic performances in music halls. It encompassed individuals who regularly wore clothing of the opposite sex in private, or sometimes even ventured into public in disguise. A notable historical fact is the existence of molly houses or secret clubs where men could gather in drag, providing a rare space for gender expression and same-sex socializing away from the prying eyes of the law. Imagine stepping into a dimly lit room, perhaps above a pub, and finding men transformed by gowns, wigs, and makeup, creating a temporary, vibrant world where societal rules about gender dissolved. You wouldn't just be witnessing a performance. You'd be seeing a desperate yearning for authenticity, a brief escape from the crushing weight of conformity. The motivations for cross-dressing were diverse and complex. For some, it was a form of sexual expression, intimately linked to their homosexual desires, providing an outlet for intimacy with partners who might also participate in gender nonconformity. For others, it might have been an exploration of gender identity, a way to feel more themselves in a restrictive society. And for some, particularly working-class women, it offered practical advantages, allowing them to gain access to male-dominated spaces or jobs, or simply to move through the city with less harassment. A quirky tidbit from police records includes instances of women arrested for disguising themselves as men, not always for illicit purposes, but sometimes simply to find work or travel more safely. It shows how the boundaries of gender were sometimes crossed out of sheer necessity, as well as desire. However, the act of cross-dressing was often fraught with danger. It directly challenged Victorian norms of gender presentation, which were inextricably linked to morality and social order. Discovery could lead to social ostracism, public humiliation, and even legal repercussions, especially if combined with charges of gross indecency for men. The authorities, particularly the police, viewed cross-dressing with deep suspicion, associating it with vice, immorality, and sexual perversion. You might find yourself constantly looking over your shoulder, terrified that a suspicious glance from a passerby or a sharp-edged constable could expose your secret, leading to your ruin. Scholars widely discuss whether the prevalence of cross-dressing in the Victorian era indicates a hidden fluidity of gender identity and sexual expression beneath the surface of a seemingly rigid society, or if it was primarily a transgressive act of rebellion against strict social norms. It is certainly plausible that while many engaged in it for personal or sexual reasons, the very act of defying gendered clothing was inherently radical in a society that relied so heavily on visual cues for social categorization. For who chose to bend these gender boundaries, their daily lives were a daring tightrope walk between self-expression and profound danger, making their intimate desires and identities a constant act of defiance against a society that demanded conformity above all else. Following the fascinating, yet dangerous, exploration of cross-dressing, let's now delve into an even more specialized and less conventional aspect of Victorian desire: fetish objects, unconventional arousal. You see, amidst the era's pervasive prudery, certain individuals found intense sexual arousal in non-traditional items, specific body parts, or even unusual scenarios, demonstrating the complex and often hidden landscape of human sexuality. The concept of fetishism, while not formally defined as a psychological term until later, was undoubtedly present in the Victorian era. People developed strong sexual attractions to objects, materials, or specific non-genital body parts that fell outside the scope of conventional desire. A mainstream historical observation is that the era's strict clothing, which covered so much of the body, paradoxically seemed to heighten the erotic allure of what was visible, or what was hinted at beneath the layers. Imagine a gentleman fixated not on a woman's face, but on the delicate curve of her ankle emerging from beneath a voluminous skirt, or the tiny, impractical buttons of her glove. You wouldn't just be seeing an aesthetic appreciation, you'd be witnessing a specific, often unspoken, sexual preoccupation, a private world of unusual stimulation. Common fetish objects or areas of focus often included feet and shoes, particularly the delicate high-arched shoes worn by women, which were seen as symbols of femininity and vulnerability. Gloves, especially long, elegant ones, also held a particular allure, hinting at the hands and arms beneath without fully revealing them. Similarly, the tight lacing of corsets could be a source of arousal, emphasizing the constriction and transformation of the female form. A curious detail from private collections and underground erotic literature of the time reveals illustrations and narratives specifically centered around these objects, confirming their role as focal points for desire. It's like a secret language, where a discarded slipper or a perfectly tied ribbon could spark a powerful, hidden fantasy. The very act of concealment, so central to Victorian fashion, inadvertently fueled these particular fetishisms. By hiding the body, society inadvertently amplified the erotic charge of the few elements that remained visible or could be imagined. The elaborate undergarments, corsets, petticoats, bustles became objects of fascination in themselves, symbolizing the layers of propriety that hinted at the forbidden within. A quirky tidbit from the medical literature often intertwined with moralizing mentions instances of men being treated for unusual sexual fixations, suggesting that these fetishes, though hidden, were present enough to concern the medical establishment. You might find a doctor scratching his head over a patient's unusual confession, trying to categorize a desire that simply didn't fit into his conventional understanding of passion. Historians and sexologists often explore whether the prevalence of certain fetishes in the Victorian era was a direct consequence of the era's repressive sexual climate, where desires found highly specific, often symbolic, outlets, or if these are simply enduring facets of human sexuality that become more noticeable under strict societal norms. It is certainly plausible that the rigid constraints of Victorian life, which suppressed overt sexual expression, compelled desire to manifest in more indirect and specific ways. For Victorians, their private worlds could hold these unconventional attractions, proving that human desire, no matter how much society tries to control or define it, will always find its own unique and sometimes bizarre pathways to arousal, lurking just beneath the surface of respectability. Stepping away from the very personal, often hidden, world of fetishes, let's now enter a dimly lit, incense-filled room where the boundaries between the spiritual and the sensual, sometimes surprisingly blurred, spiritualism, seances, and seduction. You see, the Victorian fascination with contacting the dead sometimes created unexpected opportunities for illicit encounters, transforming a quest for otherworldly connection into a stage for earthly desires. The latter half of the Victorian era witnessed a massive surge in the popularity of spiritualism, a belief system centered on communicating with the spirits of the deceased, often through mediums in seances. This wasn't a fringe movement. It attracted millions of adherents from all social strata, including prominent figures. A widely acknowledged historical fact is that seances, with their darkened rooms, hushed atmospheres, and often emotionally vulnerable participants, provided a unique environment ripe for suggestion, manipulation, and sometimes less than spiritual interactions. Imagine sitting in a darkened parlor, holding hands with strangers, hoping to hear from a departed loved one, while subtly aware of the proximity and touch of another participant. You wouldn't just be seeking communion with the dead, you'd be in a highly charged, intimate setting where inhibitions could easily lower. Mediums, often women, held significant power and influence in these settings. While many were sincere, others were undoubtedly charlatans who exploited their clients. Grief and credulity, the darkened rooms, the physical contact required holding hands in a circle, and the emotional intensity of the seances could create opportunities for flirtation or even more explicit sexual advances, often under the guise of spirit influence or magnetic forces. A curious detail from the period's numerous exposes of fraudulent mediums often included accounts of mediums seducing vulnerable sitters, or even being caught in compromising positions with clients after the lights came back on. It was like a very elaborate, dimly lit dating game, but with ghosts as the chaperones, or lack thereof. The allure of spiritualism was not just about contacting the dead. It also offered a sanctioned space for physical touch and emotional intimacy. In a society that was otherwise incredibly buttoned up, for individuals starved of physical connection, the darkness and ritual of a séance would provide an opportunity for forbidden contact, a hand squeeze that lingered, or a knee brushing against another. A quirky tidbit from the annals of spiritualism includes reports of spirit materializations that sometimes involved nude or semi-nude figures appearing in the séance room, often later revealed to be the medium or an accomplice. Further blurring the lines between spiritual phenomena and deliberate sexual display. You might pay good money to speak to your deceased aunt, only to find yourself witnessing something far more earthly and unexpected. Scholars, today, often debate whether the sexual undertones of some spiritualist practices were an intentional feature used by unscrupulous mediums, or if they were an inevitable consequence of placing vulnerable individuals in highly intimate and emotionally charged environments. It is certainly plausible that for some, the seance offered a rare, socially acceptable arena for physical closeness and emotional release that bordered on the erotic, safely distanced by the veil of the supernatural. For Victorians, their daily lives, driven by a yearning for connection beyond the grave, inadvertently created spaces where the deepest human desires, both spiritual and carnal, could intersect in ways that were both bizarre and undeniably alluring, making seances not just a channel to the afterlife, but occasionally a conduit for earthly seduction. Stepping out of the dimly lit seance rooms, where spirits and desires mingled, let's now confront a far more disturbing reality of Victorian intimate life: child marriage. Disturbing reality. You see, despite the pervasive moralizing about purity and innocence, the legal age of consent during much of the era was shockingly low, allowing for unions that, to modern eyes, were deeply unsettling and exploitative. The legal framework surrounding marriage and sexual consent in Victorian Britain was, by today's standards, truly alarming. For much of the 19th century, the legal age of consent for girls in England was 12 years old, and even lower for boys. A sobering historical truth is that while actual child marriages, where children physically married, were becoming less common, these low ages meant that sexual relations with children above this age were not considered rape under the law, provided there was consent, however coerced or nominal that consent might be. Imagine a society where a girl barely in her teens could legally agree to sexual acts, her youth and vulnerability offering little protection under the law. You wouldn't just be witnessing an outdated legal system. You'd be seeing a profound societal failure to safeguard its most vulnerable members. A truly disturbing aspect of their intimate world. This incredibly low age of consent was a legacy of older common law, which primarily focused on the capacity for procreation rather than mature understanding or agency, while moral reformers eventually campaigned for its increase. The resistance was often fierce, highlighting deeply entrenched beliefs about childhood and female sexuality. A particularly unsettling detail from historical records includes cases where older men were acquitted of what we would now consider child molestation simply because the victim was above the legal age of 12, even if she was clearly still a child. It casts a dark shadow over the era's claims of moral uprightness. The consequences of this legal loophole were profound. While not necessarily common, cases of young girls being coerced or exploited into sexual relationships by much older men, sometimes under the guise of courtship or early marriage, were a grim reality. 4 girls from impoverished families who might be forced into work at a young age, the vulnerability was even greater. A quirky tidbit, albeit a grim one, is the fierce public campaigns waged by social reformers like William Thomas Stead, whose sensational expose the maiden tribute of modern Babylon in 1885, vividly illustrated the ease with which young girls could be bought and exploited in London, forcing Parliament to finally raise the age of consent to 16. His journalistic bravery, though controversial, exposed the rot beneath the veneer of Victorian respectability. Scholarly analyses of this period often highlight that the low age of consent was not merely an oversight, but a reflection of a society that viewed children, particularly girls, as possessing limited rights and being primarily destined for marriage and motherhood. It is certainly plausible that while many Victorians found such unions disturbing, the legal framework lagged behind evolving social sensibilities allowing for deeply exploitative situations to persist. For Victorian society, this bizarre legal reality meant that the innocence of childhood was often unprotected, transforming the concept of consent into a chilling legal fiction and underscoring the stark, often brutal, power imbalances that shaped intimate lives, particularly for the young and vulnerable. Having explored the unsettling reality of child marriage and consent laws, let's now venture into an even more discreet, yet equally fascinating, aspect of Victorian intimate arrangements: sexual surrogacy, quiet arrangements. You see, in an era where societal pressure to produce heirs was immense, and traditional notions of marital intimacy were rigid, wealthy couples sometimes resorted to highly unconventional, often unspoken, methods to ensure the continuation of their lineage. In Victorian high society, the expectation for a married couple, particularly the male head of the household, was to produce legitimate heirs to inherit property, titles, and social standing. When a wife was infertile, or if the husband himself was deemed incapable, a far less commonly acknowledged issue, remember, due to male pride and medical ignorance, the pressure could become immense. A mainstream historical observation suggests that while adoption as we know it was not common for upper classes due to concerns about bloodline, desperate measures might be taken to ensure an heir. Imagine being a wealthy couple facing the social disgrace of childlessness, knowing that your entire legacy hinged on producing an offspring. You wouldn't just be dealing with personal disappointment, you'd be confronting immense family and societal pressure to secure the future of your lineage, leading to highly unconventional solutions. One such highly sensitive and rarely documented quiet arrangement could involve a form of sexual surrogacy, though not in the modern therapeutic sense. This might entail a husband discreetly fathering a child with another woman, often a servant or a woman of lower social standing, with the child then brought into the marital home and raised as the legitimate offspring of the infertile wife. The true parentage would be a closely guarded secret, known only to a very select few, if anyone. A particularly delicate detail from some family histories, pieced together through careful genealogical research and whispered anecdotes, hints at instances where a niece or ward mysteriously appeared in the household, bearing an uncanny resemblance to the master of the house, raising quiet suspicions among the servants but never openly discussed. It was a bizarre, unspoken agreement, a solution born of desperation and social pressure. The risks involved were enormous, for both the couple and the surrogate mother. If the truth were ever exposed, it would bring immense scandal, disgrace, and could even challenge the child's legitimacy, throwing the entire family's status into turmoil. For the surrogate mother, often a vulnerable woman with few options, the arrangement offered a temporary reprieve from poverty but little security or recognition of her role. A quirky tidbit, reflecting the era's medical naivete, is the belief that a woman could be impregnated by imagination or through some non-physical means, which might have provided a convenient, though medically absurd cover story for an unexpected pregnancy within the household. It shows how far people might go to preserve appearances. Modern researchers face immense difficulty in substantiating such practices due to the extreme secrecy surrounding them. Documents are rare, and accounts are almost always anecdotal or speculative. However, it is certainly plausible that, in a society so obsessed with lineage and male inheritance, such discreet and ethically questionable arrangements sometimes took place, driven by the intense societal pressures to produce an heir at all costs. For wealthy Victorians, their intimate lives could be twisted by the overwhelming demands of legacy, turning procreation into a clandestine, almost contractual affair, where the traditional boundaries of marriage and family were stretched to bizarre and often exploitative limits. From the veiled complexities of sexual surrogacy, let's now step into the more overt, yet equally varied, commercial landscapes of desire: brothels, diverse establishments. You see, Victorian cities, despite their moralistic facade, were rife with houses of ill repute, ranging from opulent, high-class establishments catering to the elite to squalid, dangerous dens in the poorest districts. The sheer variety of brothels, catering to every social class and every conceivable budget, is a well-documented historical truth of Victorian urban life. This wasn't a monolithic industry. It was a vast, stratified ecosystem of commercial sex. Imagine walking through different districts of a Victorian city, from the grand, gaslit avenues to the dark, narrow alleys. In one street, you might find a discreet, elegant townhouse with drawn curtains and a hushed atmosphere, while in another, a row of dilapidated tenements might house dozens of cramped, filthy rooms offering cheap, quick encounters. You wouldn't just be observing different levels of wealth, you'd be witnessing a stark social hierarchy even within the realm of illicit desire. It was like a stratified society compressed into a single, morally dubious industry. At the top of this hierarchy were the high-class brothels, often catering to gentlemen from the aristocracy, wealthy merchants, and politicians. These establishments were discreet, luxurious, and often run by formidable madams who provided not just sexual services, but also a veneer of respectability, fine dining, and cultured conversation. The women working there, while still prostitutes, often commanded higher fees and lived in comparative comfort, sometimes even receiving an education. A fascinating detail from the period's memoirs and police reports reveals that these brothels could act as social clubs, places where powerful men could discuss business and politics in a relaxed, confidential setting. It was like a very exclusive, very adult, gentleman's club, with an additional service menu. Conversely, at the bottom were the flash houses, common brothels, and penny dreadfuls found in the slums and working-class areas. These places were often overcrowded, unsanitary, and incredibly dangerous for both the women and the clients. Prices were low, and the women, many of whom were desperately poor, faced brutal conditions, violence, and rapid decline from disease and hardship. A quirky tidbit from the social surveys of the time, though grim, notes the sheer desperation of some working-class women who would offer themselves for a piece of bread or a small amount of gin, highlighting the abject poverty that drove many into the trade. It was a brutal, no-frills market for survival, where human dignity was the first casualty. Historians and social reformers of the era widely analyzed the existence and proliferation of these diverse brothels. Was it a necessary evil to contain? Male desire, as some argued, or a stark symptom of societal failures, particularly economic inequality and the double standards applied to male and female sexuality? It is certainly plausible that while the moral outcry against prostitution was constant, the pragmatic realities of urban life and the deep-seated demands for commercial sex ensured its enduring presence, adapting its form to suit every social stratum. For Victorians, their daily urban landscape, whether they acknowledged it or not, included these myriad establishments, each a different reflection of the era's complex, often contradictory, relationship with desire, class, and survival, making intimacy a commodity traded in countless forms. Leaving the varied landscape of Victorian brothels, let's now turn to a far more delicate and personal form of intimate exchange: love tokens, sentimental and suggestive. You see, amidst a society that often suppressed overt expressions of affection, small, discreet gifts played a crucial role, carrying hidden messages of desire, devotion, or even illicit passion between lovers. In an era where public displays of affection were frowned upon, and direct declarations of love were often reserved for formal courtship or poetry, the exchange of subtle love tokens became a mainstream historical practice for conveying intimate sentiments. These weren't grand gestures. They were often small, personal objects imbued with deep meaning, acting as silent messengers of the heart. Imagine a young woman receiving a locket, seemingly an innocent piece of jewelry, but knowing that inside lay a tiny curl of her beloved's hair, a secret symbol of their bond. You wouldn't just be holding an object, you'd be holding a coded message, a tangible piece of a clandestine romance. It was like a Victorian emoji, but far more elegant and likely to cause a scandal if discovered by the wrong person. These tokens could take many forms: miniature portraits, locks of hair, pressed flowers, small engraved rings, or even elaborately folded paper notes known as billet stew were common. The value wasn't necessarily in the material cost, but in the sentiment and the hidden meaning. Often, these items were kept secretly, tucked away in a drawer, a hidden pocket, or a cherished book, their significance known only to the giver and receiver. A fascinating detail from the period's language of flowers reveals how specific blooms carried precise meanings, allowing for highly nuanced messages of love, longing, or even rejection to be conveyed through a simple bouquet. It allowed for intricate flirtation without uttering a single, potentially compromising, word. Beyond the overtly romantic, some love tokens could carry more suggestive, or even risk, undertones, especially in illicit relationships. A particularly private gift, perhaps a piece of intimate apparel, or an object associated with a secret meeting place, could become a powerful reminder of shared experiences. A quirky tidbit from the annals of Victorian collecting reveals a fascination with hairwork jewelry, where intricate designs were woven from the hair of loved ones, not just for mourning but sometimes as highly personal and intimate tokens, exchanged between secret lovers. It's a bit eerie to our modern sensibilities, but it was incredibly popular, showing how deeply personal and physically connected these tokens could be. Historians often examine these love tokens to gain insight into the emotional and sexual lives of Victorians, particularly those relationships that existed outside the strictures of formal marriage. Did these tokens primarily serve to reinforce conventional romantic bonds, or did they also provide a vital outlet for expressing desires that could not be openly acknowledged, particularly in illicit affairs? It is certainly plausible that while their outward appearance was often innocent, their private meaning could be profoundly sensual, serving as tangible reminders of forbidden passion. For Victorians, their daily lives were filled with unspoken rules, but these small, carefully chosen objects offered a secret language, allowing desires to be felt, shared, and remembered in a world where true intimacy was often forced into the shadows. Stepping away from the delicate language of love tokens, which hinted at concealed desires, let's now confront a far more stark reality that shaped Victorian intimate lives: reproductive health, limited choices. You see, in an era before reliable contraception, couples navigated a precarious landscape where unwanted pregnancies were common, and the options for managing fertility were scarce, often dangerous. and deeply shrouded in secrecy. The absence of safe and effective birth control methods is a fundamental historical truth that profoundly impacted Victorian intimate relationships. While some rudimentary and often ineffective methods existed, such as withdrawal, rudimentary condoms made from animal intestines, or various homemade spermicidal concoctions, their reliability was minimal, and knowledge of them was often limited or seen as illicit. Imagine being a married woman, facing the relentless cycle of pregnancy and childbirth, often at great risk to your health, with virtually no reliable means to control the size of your family. You wouldn't just be managing a household, you'd be constantly navigating the biological roulette of repeated pregnancies, often leading to large families that strained resources and bodies. It was a constant source of anxiety, a biological lottery with high stakes. The primary method of birth control was often abstinence, particularly for women after they had produced a certain number of children or if their health was poor. However, this often placed a strain on marital intimacy and was not always practiced or desired by both partners. For working-class families, large numbers of children could mean even deeper poverty, driving some to desperate measures. A particularly grim detail from the period is the widespread practice of infanticide or baby farming, where infants were left with caretakers who often neglected them to death. Born out of desperation to hide or dispose of unwanted children, particularly those born out of wedlock. It highlights the brutal consequences of limited reproductive choices. While abortion was illegal and dangerous, it certainly occurred, often performed by untrained individuals using crude and perilous methods, carrying immense risks of infection, injury, and death for the woman. Advertisements for female pills or restoratives that subtly hinted at abortifacient properties could be found in some newspapers, but these were unregulated and highly dangerous. A quirky tidbit from the medical underworld is the existence of penny dreadful manuals, cheaply printed booklets that sometimes contained dangerous folk recipes for inducing abortion, reflecting the desperate search for solutions outside legal and safe channels. It shows how the lack of proper medical care forced women into incredibly risky, life-threatening choices. Historians widely discuss whether the limited reproductive choices primarily reinforced traditional gender roles by chaining women to endless childbearing, or if women actively, albeit secretly and dangerously, sought to gain some control over their fertility through whatever means available. It is certainly plausible that despite the moral and legal constraints, the intense personal and economic pressures of large families meant that individuals, particularly women, engaged in covert and often risky practices to limit births. For Victorians, their intimate lives were defined not just by desire, but by the overwhelming spectre of uncontrolled fertility, turning the act of procreation into a gamble with profound and often tragic consequences, forcing individuals into a dark web of desperate and dangerous choices. From the grim realities of limited reproductive choices, let's now pivot to the devastating social consequences for those who stepped outside the bounds of marital procreation, illegitimacy, societal shame. You see, to be born out of wedlock in Victorian society was to carry an immense stigma, casting a long, dark shadow over the lives of both the child and, particularly, the mother, often leading to ostracization and profound hardship. The concept of legitimacy was absolutely central to Victorian society, defining one's social standing, inheritance rights, and moral character. A widely accepted historical truth is that a child born out of wedlock, an illegitimate or bastard child, was legally and socially disadvantaged from birth, often carrying the mother's surname and having no legal claim on the father. Imagine being a young woman, perhaps seduced or assaulted, finding yourself pregnant, and facing the terrifying prospect of public disgrace, losing your job, and being disowned by your family, all while carrying a child who would also bear the indelible mark of shame. You wouldn't just be confronting a personal crisis. You'd be facing the full, unforgiving force of Victorian societal judgment, a judgment far harsher on women than on men. It was a societal scarlet letter, invisible yet deeply etched into one's very being. For the unmarried mother, the consequences were often catastrophic. She faced immense social ostracism, often being cast out by her family and community, deemed fallen or ruined. Her prospects for marriage, particularly to a respectable man, were virtually destroyed. This lack of support, combined with the difficulty of finding employment, often pushed desperate women into poverty, the workhouse, or even prostitution as a last resort to survive and care for their child. A poignant detail from countless historical records of workhouses and charitable institutions reveals the overwhelming number of unmarried mothers seeking refuge, their stories a testament to the brutal realities of their predicament. It paints a bleak picture, a societal trap with very few escape routes. The father of an illegitimate child, in stark contrast, often faced far fewer, if any, repercussions, while legal action could be taken to compel him to contribute to the child's support. This was often difficult to enforce, especially if he was from a higher social class or simply disappeared. The double standard was glaring, reflecting a patriarchal society that placed the burden of moral purity and the consequences of illicit sex almost entirely on women. A quirky tidbit from the era's popular fiction sometimes depicted the fallen woman finding redemption. But these were often idealized narratives that rarely mirrored the grim realities faced by most unmarried mothers, who found societal forgiveness elusive. It was a narrative designed to offer hope, but often delivered a harsh dose of reality instead. Historians and social scholars have widely analyzed how the extreme stigma of illegitimacy served to enforce strict sexual morality and patriarchal control over women's bodies and reproduction. Was it primarily a means of ensuring clear lines of inheritance and property, or a moralistic punishment for perceived female transgression? It is certainly plausible that while pragmatic concerns played a role, the profound shame associated with illegitimacy was a powerful tool of social control, ensuring that most sexual activity remained confined within the strict boundaries of marriage. For Victorians, their intimate choices were constantly shadowed by the spectre of shame, transforming an act of passion into a potential lifetime of societal condemnation for both mother and child. A brutal consequence of stepping outside the era's unforgiving moral framework. From the crushing societal shame of illegitimacy, let's now descend into an even darker realm where deviant desires were often contained and treated. Asylums, sexual deviance, confinement, you see. Victorian mental institutions, far from being solely for the genuinely insane, often became places where individuals exhibiting non-normative sexual behaviors or expressions were confined, ostensibly for their cure. The Victorian era saw a significant expansion of mental asylums, driven by evolving, though often flawed, ideas about mental illness. However, these institutions frequently served a broader social function, acting as dumping grounds for those deemed inconvenient, troublesome, or morally aberrant by their families or society. A stark historical reality reveals that individuals whose sexual behaviors diverged from strict Victorian norms, such as those exhibiting excessive masturbation, homosexual desires, nymphomania, or simply independent female sexuality, find themselves committed to an asylum, even if they exhibited no other signs of mental illness. Imagine being locked away, stripped of your freedom, simply because your desires didn't conform to what society deemed normal or healthy. You wouldn't just be losing your liberty, you'd be losing your very identity, branded as insane for your intimate inclinations. It was a terrifying form of social control, disguised as medical care. The treatments for these sexual deviations within asylums were often rudimentary, harsh, and utterly ineffective. They ranged from cold showers and bland diets to more invasive procedures like forced sterilization, though less common in Britain than elsewhere, or even crude forms of electrotherapy. The aim was less about understanding or supporting the individual, and more about suppressing the deviant behavior and enforcing conformity to societal sexual norms. A chilling detail from asylum records sometimes shows doctors recording behaviors like unnatural affections or moral insanity linked explicitly to sexual expression, demonstrating how tightly intertwined morality and perceived mental illness were in the Victorian medical mind. It reveals a brutal side of their caring institutions. For many confined, the asylum became a permanent prison. Their insanity was confirmed by their unnatural sexual tendencies, creating a circular logic that justified their indefinite detention. This practice effectively removed inconvenient individuals from public view, preserving the facade of Victorian moral purity, while denying those confined any chance at a normal life or the expression of their true selves. A peculiar anecdote, though difficult to verify in every instance, describes cases where family members paid doctors to declare inconvenient relatives insane, often to hide embarrassing sexual behavior or to prevent an undesirable marriage. It certainly makes you wonder about the true motives behind some admissions. Contemporary historical analyses deeply question whether these asylum confinements truly aimed at therapeutic intervention, or if they primarily functioned as instruments of social control, designed to police and punish sexual nonconformity. It is certainly plausible that, operating within a limited understanding of mental health and a deeply moralistic worldview, Victorian society used asylums to uphold its strict sexual code, silencing and segregating those who threatened its fragile facade of respectability. For Victorians whose intimate lives did not fit the mold, these institutions stood as a stark and terrifying reminder that private desires, if discovered, could lead to public humiliation and the ultimate loss of freedom. A truly bizarre and tragic aspect of the era's approach to human sexuality. Stepping out of the unsettling confines of Victorian asylums, where sexual deviance was locked away. Let's now explore a pseudo-scientific obsession that attempted to read sexual character directly from the human body. Phrenology, physiognomy, body readings. You see, these popular but ultimately baseless sciences claimed to unlock secrets about an individual's personality, intelligence, and even their sexual inclinations, simply by analyzing the shape of their skull or the features of their face. In the Victorian era, phrenology and physiognomy enjoyed widespread popularity, captivating both the educated elite and the general public. Phrenology claimed that a person's character traits, including their emotiveness, propensity for sexual love or conjugality, desire for marital companionship, corresponded to specific bumps and contours on the skull. Physiognomy focused on reading character from facial features, particularly the eyes, nose, and mouth. A generally accepted historical understanding confirms that these practices, though lacking any scientific basis, were embraced as ways to understand human nature and predict behavior. Imagine a stranger scrutinizing your forehead or jawline, confidently declaring insights into your deepest desires or your moral fiber, all based on a few measurements. You wouldn't just be meeting a fortune teller. You'd be encountering a scientific expert armed with charts and calipers, ready to reveal your intimate self. It was like a very public, very form of psychological profiling. Phrenologists and physiognomists would conduct public lectures, open parlors, and even publish popular manuals, offering their readings to anyone curious about themselves or others. For a small fee, you could have your head read to determine your aptitudes, your emotional tendencies, and crucially, your sexual disposition. This was particularly appealing in a society where discussing sex openly was taboo, yet there was immense curiosity about it. A fascinating detail is how phrenology charts specifically identified areas on the skull corresponding to emotiveness, located just above the nape of the neck, and parental love, allowing practitioners to give very specific, albeit erroneous, insights into a person's romantic and sexual nature. It offered a seemingly objective, scientific way to talk about forbidden topics. The implications for understanding Victorian sexuality were curious. While these practices were pseudo-scientific, they offered a seemingly legitimate framework for discussing and analyzing sexual characteristics without resorting to explicit language. They also contributed to prevailing stereotypes, often linking certain physical traits to moral virtue or vice, including sexual deviance. A quirky tidbit is the use of phrenology in some Victorian courtship manuals, advising individuals to read the heads of potential spouses to ensure compatibility, including sexual compatibility. It was like dating advice, but based on bumps on the head, truly a bizarre way to vet a potential partner. Reflecting on these practices, many scholars question whether phrenology and physiognomy primarily served as a harmless parlor game, or if they contributed to harmful stereotypes and social judgments, particularly concerning sexuality. It is certainly plausible that while offering entertainment and a pseudo-scientific veneer, these body readings inadvertently reinforced existing prejudices and anxieties about desire, offering simplified explanations for complex human behaviors. For Victorians, their daily interactions were subtly influenced by these beliefs, encouraging them to scrutinize facial features and head shapes for clues about another person's hidden character and intimate inclinations, making the very human body a canvas for bizarre, speculative readings of desire. Moving from the pseudo-scientific attempts to decode desire from physical traits, let's now turn to the very real and often dramatic lengths Victorians went to when desire stepped outside the bounds of marriage, clandestine affairs, secret meetings. You see, in a society obsessed with respectability, illicit romances thrived in the shadows, requiring elaborate strategies, coded communications, and constant vigilance to avoid devastating exposure. The prevalence of clandestine affairs, despite the severe social consequences of discovery, is a well-established historical truth of the Victorian era. For those seeking intimacy or passion outside a often loveless or purely pragmatic marriage, secrecy was paramount. Imagine a wealthy businessman, ostensibly working late, secretly slipping away to a rented room or a secluded park bench to meet his lover. You wouldn't just be witnessing an act of infidelity. You'd be observing a high-stakes game of deception, where reputation, family, honor, and even economic stability hung in the balance. It was like living a spy novel, but with much higher emotional stakes and far less chance of a happy ending. The methods employed to maintain secrecy were often elaborate. Lovers used coded language in letters, feigned illnesses or business trips as excuses to meet, and relied on trusted servants or friends as go-betweens. Meeting places ranged from private lodging houses and rented rooms to discreet corners of public parks, or even veiled encounters at social events, where a brief, lingering touch or a meaningful glance had to suffice. A fascinating detail from historical letters and diaries reveals the sheer ingenuity and risk involved in these secret communications, with messages sometimes hidden inside books or disguised as innocent correspondence to avoid detection by prying eyes. It makes you marvel at the human capacity for subterfuge when love or lust is involved. The risks of discovery were immense. For men, exposure could lead to public scandal, damage to their business or political career, and even legal action, in the form of criminal conversation lawsuits where a wronged husband could sue his wife's lover for damages. For women, the consequences were far more catastrophic: social ruin, ostracization, potential loss of children and property, and the virtual impossibility of remarriage. The societal double standard ensured that the burden of shame fell disproportionately on the female partner. A quirky tidbit is the use of assignation houses in some larger cities, discreet establishments specifically designed for secret lovers, often featuring multiple exits and private parlors to minimize the chance of being seen together. It was like a very specialized, morally ambiguous hotel, built for illicit romance. Historians often examine these clandestine affairs to understand the true nature of intimacy and desire in a restrictive society. Did they represent genuine passion, thriving against the odds, or were they sometimes merely outlets for sexual frustration born of unhappy marriages? It is certainly plausible that while some affairs were fleeting and purely physical, others represented profound emotional connections that society simply refused to sanction, forcing authentic love into the shadows. For Victorians, their daily lives could be a tense performance, where the pursuit of intimate desires often meant living a perilous double life, making love itself a dangerous secret, and proving that the human heart, for better or worse, found ways to follow its own forbidden paths. From the shadowy realm of clandestine affairs, let's now consider the immense legal and social barriers faced by Victorians, trapped in unhappy or unfulfilled marriages, divorce laws, rigid constraints. You see, ending a marriage in the Victorian era was a notoriously difficult, expensive, and often socially ruinous process, particularly for women, reflecting the era's deep-seated views on the sanctity of marriage and female subservience. The legal framework surrounding divorce in Victorian Britain was, by modern standards, incredibly restrictive, until the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857. Divorce was virtually impossible for ordinary people, requiring a costly and lengthy private act of Parliament, making it a privilege reserved almost exclusively for the very wealthy elite. Even after 1857, a mainstream historical fact is that while a national divorce court was established, the grounds for divorce remained highly unequal. A man could divorce his wife simply for adultery, but a woman had to prove adultery plus an additional offense, such as cruelty, desertion, or incest. Imagine being a woman in a miserable or abusive marriage, knowing that escaping it was almost an insurmountable legal and financial hurdle, and that even if you succeeded, your reputation would likely be in tatters. You wouldn't just be trapped in a bad relationship, you'd be trapped by the very laws of your society, with seemingly no way out. This legal inequality reflected the era's patriarchal values, which viewed a wife's adultery as a fundamental violation of property rights, her husband's lineage, while a husband's infidelity was often considered less severe, or even a natural male inclination. The process itself was public, humiliating, and incredibly expensive, involving barristers, court appearances, and detailed revelations of intimate marital failures. A fascinating detail from the records of these divorce cases reveals the extensive lengths to which private investigators would go to gather evidence, often involving spying on individuals and collecting sordid details of their private lives, further eroding any semblance of dignity. It was a brutal public spectacle, tearing apart the illusion of domestic bliss. For women, the consequences of initiating divorce were particularly dire. Even if successful, they faced immense social stigma, potential loss of their children, as custody almost always went to the father, and severe financial hardship, as their economic security was largely tied to their husband. Remarriage, particularly for a divorced woman, was often difficult or impossible, especially if she was seen as the guilty party. A quirky tidbit is the concept of a Scotch divorce, where couples might travel to Scotland, which had more liberal divorce laws, to end their marriages, albeit with some legal ambiguity back in England. It highlights the desperation some felt to escape their bonds, even if it meant navigating legal loopholes. Legal scholars and social historians often debate whether these rigid divorce laws primarily served to uphold the sanctity of marriage and family as a social ideal, or if they perpetuated immense suffering and inequality, particularly for women. It is certainly plausible that while the stated aim was moral preservation, the practical outcome was the entrapment of countless individuals in unhappy unions, forcing their intimate lives into a state of quiet desperation or clandestine affairs. For Victorians, their daily lives were lived under the heavy hand of these restrictive laws, ensuring that even when passion died or cruelty flourished, the bonds of marriage, however miserable, were incredibly difficult to break, making intimacy a lifelong commitment that often carried profound, inescapable constraints. Having explored the nearly unbreakable bonds of Victorian marriage, let's now slip into a different kind of secrecy, one where forbidden visual pleasures were hoarded away, private collections, forbidden art. You see, despite the strict public morality, wealthy Victorians often maintained hidden caches of erotic art and literature, indulging their desires away from prying eyes. A testament to the era's pervasive hypocrisy, the existence of extensive private collections of erotic and even pornographic art and literature among the Victorian elite is a well-documented historical fact, standing in stark contrast to the public's condemnation of such materials. These weren't just a few saucy prints. We're talking about entire libraries of explicit books, elaborate engravings, and early photographic plates depicting nudes, sexual acts, and scenes of transgression. Imagine being a prominent statesman or a respected industrialist, publicly championing moral purity, but privately retreating to a hidden study filled with images that would send shockwaves through polite society. You wouldn't just be a hypocrite. You'd be a curator of forbidden delights, satisfying a craving for visual stimulation that society forbade. It was like having a secret vault of desires, carefully locked away from the public gaze. These private collections often contained classical nudes, sometimes deemed acceptable in public art galleries due to their educational or artistic merit, but collected for their explicit, rather than academic, appeal. More commonly, they included contemporary erotic illustrations, often imported from more liberal continental Europe, depicting scenes that went far beyond mere suggestion. The development of photography in the latter half of the century added a new dimension, allowing for the mass production of explicit images, which were discreetly traded among collectors. A fascinating detail from historical research into these collections reveals that some even included curiosity objects, like erotic statuettes, snuff boxes with hidden explicit images, or subtly suggestive jewelry, all designed to offer private thrills. It speaks to a deep, pervasive desire for illicit visual stimulation. The secrecy surrounding these collections was paramount. Discovery could lead to social ruin, public disgrace, and even legal repercussions under obscenity laws. Collectors went to great lengths to hide their treasures, often in locked cabinets, false-bottomed drawers, or disguised as innocuous volumes on respectable shelves. The very act of owning and viewing such material was part of its allure, a thrilling rebellion against the stifling moral code. You might attend a dinner party at a grand estate, oblivious to the fact that just down the hall, behind a locked door, lay a treasure trove of art that would make your grandmother faint. Scholars today often explore whether these private collections primarily served as a testament to the enduring human fascination with the erotic, or if they highlight the profound hypocrisy of a society that preached one thing and practiced another in secret. It is certainly plausible that while a public face of piety was maintained, the private indulgence in forbidden art allowed a safe, controlled outlet for desires that could not be openly acknowledged or expressed. For Victorians, their intimate lives were sometimes marked by this duality, transforming their homes into repositories of secret desires, where art became a silent, illicit pleasure, and challenging the very notion of a universally pure Victorian soul. Leaving the hidden galleries of forbidden art, let's now consider an even more chilling and morally ambiguous practice that emerged from Victorian society's fascination with the body and its perceived abnormalities, medical curiosities, anatomical obsessions. You see, in an era of burgeoning scientific inquiry, bodies, particularly those deemed deviant or unusual in their sexual or physical characteristics, became objects of intense study, collection, and sometimes macabre public display. The Victorian period, marked by a growing interest in anatomy, pathology, and nascent fields like sexology, saw the collection and examination of human remains for scientific and medical purposes. However, this pursuit often veered into the ethically dubious, particularly when it involved bodies or body parts associated with sexual deviance, unusual physical characteristics, or perceived moral failings. A disturbing historical truth is that medical museums and private collections acquired specimens from individuals deemed abnormal in their sexual anatomy or practices, often without consent, viewing them as valuable objects for study. Imagine walking into a university lecture hall or even a private study, and seeing preserved organs or even entire skeletal remains, labeled and displayed not just for scientific learning, but for their perceived deviant interest. You wouldn't just be witnessing scientific inquiry. You'd be seeing a chilling objectification of human beings, reduced to mere curiosities for examination, sometimes even for titillation. These collections sometimes included skeletal remains of individuals believed to have been hermaphrodites, intersex individuals, or brains and reproductive organs from those deemed sexually degenerate or insane due to their sexual proclivities. The purpose was often to find a physical basis for what was considered abnormal sexual behavior, reinforcing prevailing moral judgments through pseudo-scientific justification. A fascinating detail from the medical records of the era reveals detailed drawings and descriptions of such specimens, meticulously categorized and analyzed in an attempt to classify and understand human sexuality through a purely pathological lens. It was a bizarre blend of genuine scientific curiosity and outright moral prejudice, embalmed in formaldehyde. Beyond academic collections, some curiosities even found their way into less respectable venues, such as freak shows or traveling exhibitions, where individuals with unusual physical traits, which sometimes included ambiguous sexual characteristics, were paraded for public amusement. This practice, while exploiting the individuals involved, also served to reinforce societal norms by presenting deviance as a spectacle, simultaneously fascinating and horrifying the audience. A quirky tidbit from the public exhibition circuit is the often lurid advertising for such shows, promising glimpses of anatomical wonders or nature's mistakes, further blurring the line between medical education and exploitative entertainment. It truly highlights the voyeuristic side of Victorian society. Even when it came to the intimate details of the human body, modern bioethicists and historians grappled deeply with whether the collection and display of these medical curiosities represented a legitimate scientific endeavor in its historical context, or if it was primarily a manifestation of dehumanization, exploitation, and the use of science to reinforce social prejudices about sexual and physical normality. It is certainly plausible that while some genuine research was intended, the underlying fascination often stemmed from a desire to categorize and control what was deemed sexually unconventional, creating a macabre legacy. For Victorians, their daily lives could be touched by this unsettling practice, where the very bodies that defied norms in their intimate lives might become objects of chilling anatomical obsession, proving that even after death, the gaze of a moralizing society could still seek to define and display deviance. Having explored the unsettling anatomical obsessions of Victorian science, let's now pivot to the brave, often controversial, voices that dared to challenge the prevailing silence and moral rigidity surrounding sex. Sexual reformers, challenging norms. You see, while mainstream society preached prudery, a small but growing movement of thinkers, doctors, and activists began to advocate for more open discussions, greater sexual education, and even reforms to oppressive laws, laying groundwork for future changes. The Victorian era, despite its public conservatism, was not entirely monolithic in its views on sexuality. A fundamental historical truth is that by the latter half of the century, a nascent movement of social and sexual reformers began to emerge, quietly at first, then more vocally, pushing against the rigid boundaries of public discourse. These Individuals believed that silence and ignorance surrounding sex led to widespread suffering, disease, and hypocrisy. Imagine being a courageous doctor or an outspoken activist, knowing that by simply advocating for sexual education or open discussion, you risked public condemnation, ridicule, and potentially ruin. You wouldn't just be challenging social norms, you'd be challenging deeply ingrained moral and religious beliefs, a truly daunting task. It was like shouting into a strong wind, hoping your message would somehow carry. These reformers came from diverse backgrounds. Some were medical professionals who saw the devastating effects of venereal disease and unwanted pregnancies, advocating for better public health education. Others were feminists who fought for women's reproductive rights and challenged the sexual double standard. Still others were early sexologists, attempting to apply scientific methods to the study of human sexuality, seeking to understand its diverse manifestations rather than simply condemn them. A fascinating detail from this period is the formation of secret societies or private discussion groups, where taboo subjects like contraception, prostitution reform, or even same-sex attraction could be debated among like-minded individuals, far from public scrutiny. These clandestine gatherings were vital incubators for revolutionary ideas. The efforts of these reformers were often met with fierce resistance, ridicule, and censorship. Publications advocating for sexual education or birth control were often seized, and their authors prosecuted for obscenity. Those who openly discussed prostitution or venereal disease were accused of corrupting public morals. Yet, despite the backlash, their persistent efforts slowly began to chip away at the edifice of Victorian prudery, bringing previously unmentionable topics into the fringes of public consciousness. A quirky tidbit is the surprisingly detailed, though often disguised, advice on marital hygiene or responsible parenthood that sometimes slipped past censors in seemingly innocuous health manuals, offering coded guidance to those who sought it. It was like a game of cat and mouse, with knowledge as the elusive prize. Many contemporary analyses today explore whether these early sexual reformers were truly ahead of their time, bravely advocating for modern concepts of sexual freedom, or if their views were still deeply rooted in Victorian moral frameworks, merely seeking to manage or regulate sexuality more healthily within those existing norms. It is certainly plausible that while their ideas seem progressive to us, they were often still influenced by the very societal anxieties they sought to address. For Victorians, their daily lives, for a select few, involved the perilous, yet ultimately foundational, work of challenging the very strictures that governed intimacy, laying the crucial, if slow, groundwork for a future where conversations about desire could finally emerge from the shadows. Stepping away from the brave voices of sexual reformers, let's now cast our gaze upon a vast, often overlooked, segment of Victorian society whose intimate lives were shaped more by immediate necessity than by moralistic treatises or grand reforms. Working-class sexuality, raw realities. You see, for the vast majority of Victorians living in poverty, the realities of sex, courtship, and family life were far more pragmatic, often brutal, and less constrained by the strict decorum observed by the middle and upper classes. The strict codes of sexual morality that dominated middle and upper class Victorian discourse, with their emphasis on female purity, male chastity before marriage, and the sanctity of the domestic sphere, often held little sway in the crowded tenements and harsh workplaces of the working class. A pervasive historical truth is that economic survival, cramped living conditions, and different cultural traditions often dictated the realities of working-class intimate lives. Imagine a family of 6, sometimes more, crammed into a single room with little privacy, you wouldn't just be witnessing poverty. You'd be observing a constant blurring of personal boundaries, where the very act of living made polite modesty almost impossible. It was a stark contrast to the secluded bedrooms of the wealthy, a constant, raw exposure to the realities of human existence. Courtship and sexual relations among the working class often followed different patterns. While formal marriage was an aspiration, cohabitation and premarital sexual activity were often more common and less stigmatized, particularly if they led to eventual marriage or if resources were too scarce for formal ceremonies. The pressure to marry often intensified when a pregnancy occurred, reflecting a pragmatic desire to legitimize children rather than a strict adherence to religious doctrine. A striking detail from social surveys of the era, conducted by reformers trying to understand urban poverty, frequently noted the prevalence of common law marriages and children born out of wedlock, which, while still carrying some social weight, were less ruinous than for their middle-class counterparts. It paints a picture of resilient communities adapting to harsh conditions. For working-class women, their sexuality was often intertwined with their labor. Many young women worked in factories, domestic service, or shops, environments that offered both economic independence, however, meager and opportunities for social interaction and sexual encounters away from direct parental supervision. While sexual exploitation was a constant threat, particularly for domestic servants, these women also exercised agency, navigating their relationships within their own social milieu. A quirky tidbit from working-class folklore and popular songs sometimes celebrated illicit liaisons or bawdy humor, showcasing a more open, less judgmental attitude towards sexuality than that found in polite society. It was a testament to their resilience and their own distinct cultural norms. Many contemporary historians emphasize that the study of working-class sexuality challenges the monolithic view of Victorian prudery, revealing a more nuanced and diverse sexual landscape. Was their seeming looser morality a result of moral degradation due to poverty, as some contemporary middle-class observers argued, or a more pragmatic adaptation to their challenging circumstances, reflecting different cultural values? It is certainly plausible that while economic hardship shaped many aspects of their lives, working-class communities developed their own informal norms and coping mechanisms regarding sexuality, prioritizing communal support and survival over abstract moral codes. For Victorian working-class individuals, their intimate lives were a raw, unfiltered response to their environment, a testament to the enduring human capacity for connection and desire, even amidst the harshest of realities. Having explored the raw realities of working-class sexuality, let's now bring our intricate journey through Victorian intimacy to its thoughtful conclusion. Reflecting on its enduring impact, Victorian legacy, enduring shadows. You see, the era's complex, often contradictory attitudes towards sex and desire didn't simply vanish with the turn of the century. They cast long, fascinating shadows that continue to influence our modern understanding of morality, gender, and intimacy, even today. The Victorian era, with its rigid public decorum and hidden private desires, created a powerful cultural blueprint that deeply shaped subsequent generations. The emphasis on female purity, the sexual double standard, the medicalization of female desire, and the criminalization of certain sexual expressions, these were not just features of the 19th century. They became deeply embedded in Western societal norms, influencing laws, social expectations, and individual psyches for decades. even centuries to come. A foundational historical truth is that many of the sexual taboos and anxieties we grappled with in the 20th century, and even some that persist today, can trace their origins directly back to Victorian moral codes and their efforts to control human sexuality. Imagine looking at a modern advertisement or a public debate about sexual freedom and recognizing echoes of Victorian anxieties about indecency or moral decay. You wouldn't just be observing contemporary culture, you'd be seeing the subtle, lingering influence of an era long past. It's like finding a Victorian ghost in your modern sensibilities, quietly influencing your perspective. The era's bizarre attempts to cure masturbation, its medicalization of hysteria, and its creation of strict social categories for sexual behavior left a complicated inheritance for future generations of medical professionals and psychologists. While these practices were eventually discredited, the underlying tendency to pathologize or control non-normative sexual expressions continued in different forms. A fascinating detail is how some early 20th century sexologists, even as they broke new ground, still sometimes used Victorian moralistic language to frame their discussions, showing how deeply ingrained the era's ideas truly were, even in those who sought to challenge them. It's a subtle reminder that even progress often carries the imprints of the past. Yet, the Victorian era also laid some groundwork for eventual sexual liberation, albeit inadvertently. The very extremity of its prudery and the widespread hypocrisy it bred eventually sparked backlash and reform movements. The brave voices of early sexual reformers who dared to speak about contraception or venereal disease sowed seeds that would blossom into more open discussions in the 20th century. The sheer volume of underground pornography and the pervasive reality of prostitution, despite repression, demonstrated the enduring and irrepressible nature of human desire, forcing society to eventually confront its own contradictions. A quirky tidbit from the early 20th century is how the advent of Freudian psychoanalysis, while not entirely free of its own biases, provided a new language to discuss repressed desires and neuroses, offering a framework that helped people begin to understand the psychological weight of Victorian sexual suppression. It was like finally finding the vocabulary for a feeling that had been building for generations. Ultimately, the Victorian legacy concerning sexuality is not a simple story of black and white, but a complex tapestry woven with threads of repression and resistance, public virtue and private vice, scientific curiosity and moral panic. Our journey through its bizarre practices reveals that human beings, regardless of their era, constantly navigate the tension between their inherent desires and the ever-present pressures of social convention. As we close this chapter, let the intricate details of Victorian bedroom